Hi, I'm Daniel Jason Booth, and you're watching SBL Mixing. I absolutely love the sound of drums and the challenge of recording them. To me, they are a primal instrument, second only in importance to the human voice, and therefore one of the most essential to know how to capture well. Today, I'll take you through my process of recording drums and how you can get solid and professional sounding results even at home. Recording drums is both an art and a science, and it's certainly one of the biggest challenges for musicians or engineers working out of a home studio. In this video, I'll give you a quick primer in phase and how to understand a phase correlation meter, and then I'll take you through the actual microphone placements on my drums. I'll give you my thoughts behind the decisions I'm making. By the end of the video, you'll have a really good understanding of how all of this works and be able to apply what you learn straight away. There are many factors that contribute to a great drum recording. They all matter, of course, but we'll focus on getting better mic placements because I think that's one of the most important aspects and also one of the most overlooked. Now, I don't have your room, your mics, your drums, your gear, but that's okay. What I'm about to show you works pretty much anywhere big enough to fit a drum kit. With time and care, you can get really good results you'd be proud to put in your productions. Here's what I'm using today. As far as I'm concerned, we must consider 4 different needs that must ideally converge and find a middle ground when it comes to good microphone placement. These are timbre, phase coherency, practical placement, and consideration of spill. Consider each of these 4 things as you place microphones. Timbre refers to placing each microphone to capture the character and optimal tone of each drum and the kit as a whole. As we're using more than one microphone, we usually encounter phase problems, and we never completely eliminate them, but we can certainly minimize their effect through better mic placement. And I'll show you exactly how to do that. Practical placement just means placing mics where they don't interfere with the performer. Pretty straightforward there, but you may find the optimal mic positions for timbre are in the way of the player. So you've got to make that compromise there. And lastly, you also need to consider the spill of adjacent parts of the kit into a microphone. If, for example, you find you cannot fix a spill issue through mic placement alone, then consider using a different microphone or changing mic settings to suit. Here's what you'll need. A good sounding room. It doesn't need to be perfect. A tuned drum kit. I've spent quite a bit of time honing the tuning on my drums. You'll need headphones to listen as you place mics, patience, and really long arms or someone to assist you. I'll also be using 2 free plugins to explain and demonstrate some phase-related concepts. So follow the download links in the description below for Voxengo, Corellimeter, and Flux Stereo Tool version 3. I highly recommend these both, but a stock correlation meter that came with your recording software could also do the job. So let me explain how they both work and how best to use them. Here's a very quick primer in understanding phase and how to interpret correlation meters. Okay, so I don't really want to get bogged down in a massive explanation about phase. I just want to show you how to use this plugin and this plugin so that you can understand what you're seeing and make better decisions. What I've got here is one of the most basic representations of sound, which is a sine wave. It doesn't have the complexity of the drums, but what it can do is it can help show how these plugins work at the most basic level. So these plugins are on the stereo bus. They're monitoring the left and the right sides. When there are differences on the left and the right sides, we're going to see things change in phase. At the moment, both of these signals are exactly the same. So when we play it, it's indicating that it's in the center and it's indicating that it's at +1. So that means that the left and the right channels are exactly the same and they're both in phase. What happens if I go in and I turn this right channel upside down, where the peaks become the troughs and the troughs become the peaks? Let's do that. I'm going to flip the polarity. And this is the result when we play that back. As you can see, the signal goes all the way to -1. So when we have a signal pan to one side and the other, what we can do is compare how much in phase they are. If they're exactly in phase, then this plugin will indicate that that is +1. But what if we want to know a bit more information? That's where this plugin here comes into play, which you can resize, by the way. Okay, I'll just close that out and then I'll reopen it. So now it's a bit bigger. Over here, you can set the time that it takes to compare the two signals going into the left and the right channels. Don't worry about this too much. You can leave that on 1 second. Along the bottom, you can change the density of frequencies that it's showing. This plugin here, this correlation meter, this is a multiband correlation meter. As opposed to this one, it's basically this correlation meter on steroids. If we were to turn this meter 90 degrees on its side, this plugin here is representing phase across frequency bands. So when we get to more complex waveforms such as drums, anything above this line is in phase. Okay, and that's from 20 hertz all the way up to 20 kilohertz. And anything below the line is out of phase. Both of these have some really good qualities to them. Now, I prefer to use this plugin while I'm doing the drum thing, but I can't explain it without showing you what that one means first. And just as one last quick example, if I move this a little bit out of phase, have a look at what happens on the meters. Let's move it again. At this point, we are exactly 90 degrees out of phase and partially cancelling out. And moving it again, you can see that we're starting to get more out of phase. Until we are completely out of phase. When you think about it from the perspective of you've got two mics that are similar, say, for example, the overhead's picking up the snare drum, moving one overhead that is capturing the snare a little bit later, that much later, for example, if we move that second mic a little bit closer, that can move the signal potentially back into phase. So that's what we're trying to achieve when we move mics around. And this particular plugin does a great job of representing the tonal balance between the two mics and whether that tone is in or out of phase. So the more that we can get this above the line when we're moving mics around, the stronger our recording will be. It's one factor to consider, and it's one that I'm going to focus on quite heavily in this video. Let's move on to miking the drums in a more practical sense, now that we've got some of that theory out of the way. All right, so with the snare top mic, I'm just going to take it off the stand and I'm just going to have a play around and have a listen and just see what sort of tonal possibilities are available. So try everything, try different angles, different heights. Then once you've found something that you're happy with, lock it off. Phase is not yet a concern until we add another mic, which is exactly what we're going to do now. We're going to add a bottom snare mic. So here I've got the top mic panned to the left and the bottom mic panned to the right. In the headphones, I'm only monitoring the snare bottom to listen for the tone of that. And I'm also keeping an eye on the correlation meter to see how the phase relationship is going. So this mic is not really an issue for the drummer because it's underneath the drum, but it is showing that it's out of phase in the low end, but it's out of phase by quite a lot, which is great, because what I'll do is I'll use this plugin here to flip the polarity of the bottom snare mic track. And now we are showing back in phase. So now that they're working together, we can treat both of these as one. So I've set up a mono bus for the snares and they will both be routed to that. Next, we're going to add a kick in mic. So I want to pan the snares to the left-hand side and we'll put the kick in mic to the right-hand side. In actual fact, what I did in this video was wrong. I've panned them both to the same side. Don't do that. That'll get you nowhere. They need to be panned to opposite sides. Otherwise, you won't be able to compare the signals. So by the time I get to this next clip of the bass drum, I've realized my mistake and it is rectified. And as you can see, when I play the kick drum, it shows that the spill entering from the kick into the snare mic is actually out of phase. All of that low end information that's important to the kick drum is actually out of phase in the snare drum. Now this may or may not be a problem, we'll see as we progress, but I would really like to get it in phase. So I'm going to repeat the exercise that I undertook with the snare top mic and the bottom mic for the snare and just hunt around for tone. I'm really preferring that position there, even though there are positions that are more in phase with the snare. That seems to be the tone that I'm after. So I keep coming back to that. Even though it's out of phase, I'd much rather it be out of phase in the low end. The top information isn't as critical and I can flip the polarity in order to get that back into phase. And as you can see when I play the snare drum, the bleed into the kick drum is actually out of phase. In the background, you'll see that I'm copying that plugin across from the bottom snare to the snare master, and that just flips the polarity again of both snares, which in turn puts it back into phase with the kick drum. Next up, I'm going to add a sub kick mic to reinforce the bottom end. So it should be noted here that the sub kick is panned to the right side, same as the kick in mic. And straight away we can see that they're in phase. So now I'm going to do the same as what I did with the snare, which is I'm going to bus them to their own track and treat them as one. And I'm going to pan it to the left because the next thing we're going to do is the left overhead. That will get panned to the right hand side so we can compare phase. Now once again, don't do what I've done here, which is to pan the overhead left to the left hand side with the other tracks. That's not going to work. You have to pan it to the opposite side of the other tracks that you're comparing to. Now pay close attention to the correlation meter as I play the snare drum and move the mic up and down and around. As I move it up, it gets to 90 degrees out and then we get back into phase. If I move it further up to the ceiling, it gets 90 degrees out again. And now we're getting back into phase. So considering that I can flip the polarity of the overheads, I've got quite a few options there that I can play with, but I want to choose the most optimal place. Now, what's interesting here is that the kick is actually showing that it's out of phase when the snare is in phase with the overheads. So the overhead and the snare drum mics like each other, but the overheads and the kick drum mic don't. They don't work together. So that's an issue and we just might have to accept that the snare drum is going to have to be out of phase with the kick drum. So this isn't a huge issue, but I would much prefer the kick be in phase with the overheads than be in phase with the snare drum because they're generally not played at the same time. So we'll address that soon, but I want to draw your attention to how much of a difference the height of the mic can make in particular. So I'm pretty happy with that position and I'm going to lock it off. It's worth measuring the distance to the snare drum. I'm just using a laser measure and that just gives me a rough idea of where the other mic might need to go. I'm now just going to have a look at both the overheads. So I'm now going to work on this other overhead. I'm going to pan the overhead right to the right and the overhead left to the left hand side, and then we'll just play with the position. Now, I'm going to extremes here, but it's really interesting to see how all these different positions work and influence the phase relationship between the two overheads. So I'm just looking for the position where they mostly agree in terms of the entire spectrum, but also where they're going to pick up the parts of the kit that I want to be picked up. That microphone is pretty much looking at the second half of the kit. If you're dividing the kit in half, it's looking at that second half. So where that gets placed obviously has to be a consideration, even though there might be multiple places that it works in phase. So when I find a position where I think it will work and it's picking up all the drums that I want it to pick up, I'll put it on a stand, and from there I want to try and match the distance to the snare drum to that of the other overhead. This took me a few tries because obviously I'm considering phase, I'm considering position, I'm also considering the distance. The distance wasn't quite there, it was too far away. So once I've found a position that's in phase and the same or similar distance, then we're good to go. Now that I'm happy with the position, I need to check to see if the kick is in agreement in both overheads. This is not the same as comparing an overhead to the kick drum mic. Okay, so this is great. The overheads agree on the direction of the phase, but both of them are opposite to what the kick drum is. All right, so at this point, I just want to stop there and recap just so we can get our heads around these phase things, because it can get a little bit confusing. It even confuses me sometimes. What have we established? We've established that the snare top and the snare bottom are out of phase with each other. So what I did was I flipped the polarity on the bottom mic. I could have done that to the top mic and that would have had the same effect because they're out of phase with each other. All that means is that they're going in opposite directions, okay? Yes, opposite directions. Flipping the polarity on that bottom mic made it go in the same direction as the top mic. It doesn't matter which direction it goes, as long as they move in the same direction, okay? That's a very important point. The snare, having been corrected, was then summed so that both tracks were then on one track. And then we added in the kick drum and discovered that the kick drum was out of phase. It's acting in a different direction. So what I did was I flipped both of the snares so that they're going in the same direction, okay? They're going in the same direction and now they're working together, not against each other. Then we added the sub kick and there weren't any issues there, so we moved on quickly to the overhead left. So we've got all the kicks, all the snares to one side being compared to the overhead left. And what we found is that the snares were working in the same direction as the overhead left, but the kicks were actually working in the opposite direction. They were out of phase, and that is a big issue. Moving along to the next overhead, I wanted to establish that first and then come back and fix the issues. The next thing was to add in the overhead right and compare both of the overheads to each other. Okay, they agreed that the snare was in phase, they were moving in the same direction, and they agreed that the kick was in phase. Okay, when you're only listening to the overhead left and the overhead right. Okay, that is different to when you add in the snare or the kick mic. In this case, when we added in both the snares, they were actually moving in the same direction as the overheads. But the kick, again, was out of phase, okay? So what I did was I took both of the overheads, I flipped the polarity, okay? So now they're working in the same direction as the kick drum, but that pulls the snare drum out of phase. So I then had to reverse my decision to flip the polarity on the snare, on the combined snare, and now they are working in phase with the overheads. I hope that makes sense. If it doesn't, let me know in the comments below. But I just wanted to recap that there because I know it's such a confusing subject. On with the rest of the kit. Next up, we're exploring the tone of the first rack tom, and we will decide on a position and a phase direction and we'll stick with that. It looks like this one is going to be in phase, which is good. We're comparing it against the overheads, which are panned together opposite the rack tom, so we can compare the phase against both overheads. So I'm just trying to find a position that works for me as the drummer and also gives a pleasing tone and is in phase mostly or mostly out of phase. Ideally, I'd like it to be in positive phase like it is, but you don't always get that, as you'll see in this next example with the rack 2 tom. So straight off the bat, we recognize that it's mostly out of phase with both the overheads, and that's okay, we can work with that. Ideally, I want the microphone as close to the drum as possible so that I don't have as much spill coming in from other parts of the kit adjacent. So whilst I'm considering that, I'm also considering playing position and also the phase, whether it's working in the opposite direction mostly or mostly out. So in this case, we will end up flipping the polarity of this drum so that it works with the overheads. So I'm just going to add that now. We're going to put an EQ on there and then we're going to flip the polarity, and that will put it back into phase, as you can see. Cool, we're now going to add in rack tom 3 and go through a similar process. We're working along the same lines and we're trying to find a position, and it's pretty obvious that it's going to be out of phase with the overheads. We are mostly out of phase, and we're going to treat that the same way as we did rack tom 2. To save time, I'm just going to copy that setting straight across to rack tom 3. And now we're up to the floor tom, the last tom-tom that I have, and it again is mostly out of phase, so we're going to have to do the same thing again. I'm just going to try and work on getting that mostly in phase, but I think in this case I actually struggle quite a bit. So when it rings out of phase, but initially it rings in phase further up the spectrum. I don't think that's too big of an issue because it actually rings out mostly in the low end. Okay, it's a low drum. So I think that'll work. We just now need to remember to copy those settings across to flip the polarity so that that mic works with the overheads and not against them. So what you're listening to is the raw drums, and I've reversed the left and the right channels just so that it gives you the correct perspective. I always mix in drummer's perspective. I'm pretty happy with these results. So now I've added in the cymbals that I've got over the top. It's important when you place the cymbals that you don't place them directly above the mics, because that can really sound like crap. The tom-toms in particular will start reflecting off the bottom of the cymbals, and that's not a good sound. can of course add as many mics as you like, and in this case I might even consider adding in a spot mic for the ride cymbal and possibly for the hi-hats. You could also look at adding a room mic in to the mix, and you just go through that same process of checking the phase against, in particular, the overheads, but also the snare and the kick, because they're probably going to be the ones that you want to strengthen. Okay, so try and find a spot where they all work. And that of course also applies to when you're adding in any spot mics. So I'm pretty happy with the results considering my room isn't perfect. The drums are tuned beautifully and obviously I can play, so that's kind of half the battle won really, I think. But placement is so important, and I think you really need to nail that down so that you can get the most out of what conditions you're working in and what mics you're using. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed that. I hope you got a lot out of it. If you would like to support my channel, I would so very much appreciate it. You can become a Patreon supporter, or you can buy a t-shirt down below. Like the video, please share it around to your friends, and of course subscribe if you haven't already and hit the bell notification. Thank you so much again for watching, and happy recording.